Hey, welcome back to the Joe Silverback Show and part two of creating our own story and making our own decisions. And the first, well, if you remember from part one, we were talking about the silverback and making a decision to stay in the garden, to stay in the forest, versus Homo sapiens, who decided to leave the garden, get out of the garden, and follow the god of technology, which came from his superior, wonderful, self-indulgent, self-righteous brain. All of that in good humor. So if we're talking about acceptance and awareness, which I don't know how anyone can debate and argue that today with the fact of the reality that we are creating our own story and we are fascinated with ourselves so much that we spend most of our waking consciousness now thinking about how we can project ourselves back at ourselves through technology. So let's just accept that premise that we have created our own story all along. We are continuing to create our own story all along, and the technology that we have created out of our infinite wisdom, magnificent mind brain is that not only are we going to be able to create our own story collectively, we're going to be able to do it individually, individualistically. That means that each and every one of us, each and every one of you watching this right now, doesn't have to listen to my story, but you're going to be able to take and pick from any story you want and shape the you out there that you want to be. Now, you may laugh at that and you may say, hey, that's funny, but that's essentially what we are doing. And we are creating our own story in this way. I mean, let's say that you're a teenager and you get on the web and you don't want to be an underaged child communicating with adults, and someone says, how old are you? And you create your own story and you make up, oh, I'm 18, I'm 19, I'm 20. And then, you go to the next answer and answer that question and say, well, as a matter of fact, I'm an Irish redhead who loves, punk rock. So you start to shape a story about yourself. And then you go to, you get to be 21, 22, 23, and maybe you're a little bit depressed because the Irish redhead punk rocker that you wanted to be is, in some band, and she's really famous and she's getting, marriage proposals and all the sex she wants and incredible diamond rings and gifts and houses, etc., etc., etc. But that is not you. That was just a fantasy story that you created that you wanted to be. So that's an interesting take on what technology is offering us, that we are either accepting or rejecting at all times. So one of the things that I like to say is, okay, since this is now the new wisdom medium and this is all the knowledge medium, and we are gaining through our movies, through our reality shows, through our YouTube channels, through our news media, constantly we're getting this story reflected back, and then we're making our own stuff and we're getting that reflected back, and we're also getting it reflected outward. So let's get down to it. If I'm in charge of creating the story that I want, what does the story look like? And what does the end of the story look like? So I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell on one of these writer workshops, or one of these workshops. I don't, since I'm a writer, they throw out stuff, and since I've read Malcolm Gladwell's books, they throw me stuff by him, and it's kind of cool. Wow, this is what I'm reflecting. It's being reflected back. That's my God at the moment, and Malcolm Gladwell is teaching me a course on writing. And it's a 5-minute course. And what did he say that was so fascinating that most people don't think about unless they are writers, or unless they are writers listening to Malcolm Gladwell talk about what his successes have been? He said most people think about the beginning of the story and then they get into the heart of it, When in reality, what you need to do that makes it so easy is think about the conclusion that you want to have, the end of the story. Once I have the end of the story, I can create the rest of it. Now that's very powerful. Once you have the end of the story, you can fill in the rest. But what happens if you're living your life and you're living just the beginning of a story, but you haven't thought out the consequences? Therefore, you haven't thought about the ending. So you may be living some trajectory that's going to be, you know what, I'm going down this cliff right now with the rest of these gazelles, deer, human beings, fools that, didn't pay attention either. So let's take a breath and say, what's the end result we want? Then we can figure out how our choices now are going to lead to that end result. Now that's an interesting deviation from opening up at the beginning of the novel and not knowing what's at the end, or opening up at the end of the novel and saying, wow, I'm so curious about how they're going to get there. And that's what Malcolm Gladwell was saying, and I'm taking Malcolm Gladwell's little piece of wisdom for writers like myself in terms of writing a story and saying, hey, how can we pass this on to each other? And that's what goal setting is all about. How can you set a goal if you don't know what the end result is that you want? Well, I want to lose 50 pounds. Fine. Now we know what to do. Well, I want to get $1 million. Fine. Now we know what to do. Well, I'm just trudging through life like everybody else. Well, now you know why you don't have any control over what you're going to get. And what you're going to get might be something that you have no even awareness of because you never put any attention to it in the first place. So, story creation is very, very critical. Yuval Harari is talking about his story. His story, the story of mankind, the story of our evolution. And he's doing that with deep, deep awareness that once he shows us where we've been, once he shows us what our outcomes have been and what our trajectories have been and what our trajectories are going towards, that can help us look at, okay, where do we want to go from here? It's an exciting time and it's a scary time because for the first time in our history, as E.O. Wilson and Harari and others like them who are deep thinkers that have looked at history, have looked at evolutionary biology, have looked at plant and animal evolution, trajectories, patterns, have said, wow, where are we going to go from here? So where would you like to go from here? Let me just start off with that. If you are married, what would you like for yourself in that marriage? What would you like for your husband or your wife? What would you like for your marriage partner? If you're connected to your mother and your father, what would you like for them at the end of their lives? What would you like for your children? What would you like their futures to be? What kind of lifestyle do you want? And what kind of lifestyle do you have? And what kind of lifestyle do you believe is really ideal? And how can you create that? You can't create it if you don't know what you want, which is the end game. So let me tell you about what I want, which is my end game. So I've talked about this already on earlier videos, and I can't say enough that I want time to read and write and think. I am enamored with Hermann Hesse's story of Siddhartha, who said, when asked by the businessman, well, what can you do? And he said, I can read, I can write, and I can think. Maybe he said I could read and write, think, and wait. Somehow waiting was in there because his deep patience was one of his greatest virtues and assets. And a businessman said to himself, wow, you can read and write. That's cool because not a lot of people can read and write. And if you can wait and be patient, and if you can think, I can teach you a bunch of stuff But I can't teach people how to think. And I'm telling you today, guys, we have a crisis on our hands here because it's painful for us to think. And it's painful for us to listen to others go through a process of thinking about something because especially if we don't want to listen to it. I did something pretty funny last night. I also got in a big mess because, anyway, I won't tell you about the mess, but it was just another blunder that I made as a man in relationship to the beautiful woman who takes care of me and whom I love dearly. And I did not recognize her in a way that she should have been recognized yesterday. So I'm asking the universe for forgiveness. But in the meantime, what I did that was kind of very interesting is that I took my son and his best friend out to dinner just for a guy time. They had just come back from about 10 days up in Idaho chasing rivers and chasing fish. 3 of them, best buddies from high school. Now they're in their second year of university, and their summertime they spent doing some guy stuff. And I wanted to give them recognition for a couple things. One, as you know, it takes a lot of work to get, out in the outback with a bunch of guys or just by yourself as a guy, but with a couple buddies as, young guys, and just be primitive. It takes planning, but it's incredible and there's nothing like it. And as you also know, I want to celebrate that because I think that's one of the best areas where male primates can pound their chest and hoot and holler and not have any females, ask them questions or tell them to make sure they have their boots on or not get wet or not get poison ivy or not get cut. All the things that happened to my son and his buddies when they came back from just being by themselves and learning to face danger and take risks that guys do out in the wild and do primitive things and get goofy. Okay. So I wanted to say, guys, I recognize this as special. And I want you guys to recognize this as special in several ways. Number one, you guys are all going off in your second year of universities, and you only have a few breaks, during the year that you can join each other. Number 2, you all fall in love. One of you was in love a year ago. One of you is in love now. 2 of you are single now, but you'll be in love in the next semester. And what happens with falling in love is the most incredible, remarkable thing, but it can't be the only thing. And the younger you are, the more you think it is everything. But develop this time, set aside a time just to go with your buddies out doing these fishing trips. Connect with nature, connect with men, connect with, just no females around. And of course, when you start having families and that kind of thing, and you want to go camping with your family and make nice cup of coffee and grill over the fire for your wife and take your kids and show them things that you learned, that's awesome. But along the entire journey, have your solitude time and have your guy time with your buddies that can be primitive and wild with no females around who can want you to be thinking and behaving more like they would, which is good for a lot of your time, but not all of your time. So how did we get to that, and how does that tie in with, choices and decisions? It has a lot to do with how we set up our futures, and how we follow our story. We're constantly from day one going into schools and having teachers tell us what to think constantly. And by the time we get into high school, they really want us to regurgitate what they think constantly. Universities now have no longer producing thinkers. They're producing regurgitators of their own philosophies and theories that they want us to put into, their books or into their data or into practice. We need time to get away from all of that and get into our own story and get some time alone by the river to do what Siddhartha did, which was to wait, to watch, to listen, and to learn to think. To wait, to watch, to listen, and to learn to think can only come through a few sources. One is deep reflection through reading and deep reflection through solitude, either solitude in meditation, which is profound, and solitude in nature, which is a different medium than from being inside a church, a synagogue, a TV, a computer, a house. It's wild, it's primitive, it's connected to plants and animals and mineral consciousness that gives us something different. To wait, to watch, to listen, and to learn to think. That's really critical, because otherwise, how can you tell what the end of the story is going to be that you want? And that's, I think, what I was starting to say, is that I want a deep amount of my time to be time in nature by myself, with my boys, with men, alone, with my writing, with my thoughts. And so I love to read, I love to write, and I love to think. I love to wait and watch and listen at the seashore, looking out to the ocean, by the river, listening to the voices, hear the wind blowing through the trees, closing my eyes and trying to understand what the wind is teaching me. And all of this makes me come back to this story that we are creating. You're the thinker, you're the creator. Namaste.